Whether we're playing war games or Dungeons and Dragons, terrain comes in all shapes and sizes. But so does scatter terrain, and what exactly is scatter terrain and how much of it do you need? Let's talk about it. Typically, at least in wargaming, a lot of scatter terrain is little things that you would scatter around the table. It's pretty self-explanatory. That can be everything from like these little bunkers to boxes and barrels and things like that. Although you'll notice that I have mounted mine onto a base, and I've really only done that because it helps to make it a little bit more durable. You don't really need to take it to that extreme. You could just glue those boxes together in the shape roughly of some cover. And depending upon the game that you're playing, cover can do a few different things. It can be half cover or full cover or any number of things in between. And what that really just boils out to is how much of the miniature is visible behind said cover. If you can't see most of the model, then it's full cover. If you can see from about the waist up or the waist down, well, then that's usually considered half cover, and it provides different bonuses to the miniature for hiding behind it. Or at least in some games. In some games, cover is cover, or cover is no cover, and if you can see the model in any way, shape, and form, you can hit it. But there's also stuff like objective markers. Usually it's just a way of indicating where the objective is going to be, but I tend to like to make them in a much larger scale, which means when I'm playing a game that doesn't have an objective, this can now be used as a piece of terrain. And although it may not be line of sight blocking, it can force models to have to pick a path to move around it instead of just charging straight down the table. And there's something to be said for that. Now, depending upon who you ask, larger pieces of terrain and cover tend to just be terrain. In my personal opinion, stuff like this is still scatter terrain. I have tons of things like this, from little graveyard walls to sandstone fortress, like ruin type things, and little statuettes and stuff that can just be populated all over the table. Yeah, I love this stuff. I think it's great. The more of this stuff that I can get my hands on, I try to. Now, depending upon the type of game that you might be playing, a piece of terrain like this could do a lot of different things. But typically in most games, what it's going to do is it's going to have to cause you, the player, or your opponent, to decide which way a vehicle is going to go. As in most games, vehicles cannot pass through terrain. Although that does mean that units could pass through this, or perhaps could shoot through this. But this could be a really great way to kind of force tanks to move in a specific way and really break up units. Now, if you're not really familiar with wargaming and perhaps you're more familiar with tabletop gaming, this might feel a little strange to think about. But in wargaming, typically, the players will take turns putting terrain on the table in order to kind of make things a little bit more fair. Or even get a third-party person to go ahead and set up the table for them. And these are the type of things that, as a wargamer, we kind of have to really think about when it comes to placing our terrain on the table, whereas a dungeon master is probably just trying to set a scene to make it look cool so that the players have something interesting to look at while the combat is happening. Today's project is going to be a really great way to get rid of a lot of scrap material. So if you've got a little offcuts that are large enough that you didn't want to throw away, but you're not really sure what to do with them, today's project is going to be a great way to get rid of those. Now, if you can't afford base material, and what I mean by that is something to glue everything to, because a lot of the options that a lot of YouTubers will tell you to use can kind of be expensive, especially if you buy in bulk. Today's project is going to thank your wallet because we're going to be using old CDs. So go ahead and grab some old CDs, some old DVDs, stuff you don't really care about, something that has maybe been in a drawer, just forgotten about. And let's go ahead and use those as the base of this project. Now, to start with, we're going to glue down some of our scraps. This is going to build up the shape of the terrain that we're going to be building. And then on top of that, any kind of trees, if they're removable from the base, go ahead and glue the base of that tree down. And then we're going to mix up some paper pulp along with some kind of plaster of Paris that will work just fine. That's what I tend to use. If you want to mix some rocks or aggregate in with this, you can, but honestly, it's a bit of a waste, and we'll do that later. So now, one of the reasons we're using paper pulp instead of just mixing up the plaster the way it is I find that it does two things. Number one, if the plaster starts to shrink, it doesn't tend to crack, which can then cause you to have to go back in with a more runny plaster and fill all those cracks. And number two, it does strengthen it a little bit. Now, if you're worried about the dry time and you want to extend the dry time, you can add some PVA white glue into this mixture, and it will slow it down a little bit without affecting the way it sticks to stuff. So that's just a little tip if you're not sure if you're going to be mixing up a ton of this. Because I'm only making 3, I don't really need to worry about that, but if I was going to make like 20 of these, I would definitely add more glue in just to kind of slow down the dry time. So next you're going to want to go ahead and you're going to spread it around on the base. Now you're going to want to use an old paintbrush that you don't care about, and you're going to get that soaking wet, and that's going to allow you to kind of manipulate the plaster and push it around on the CD. Now the goal is to try to get a roughly even coat around the outside edge, and then just allow that paper pulp to kind of help create subtle variations in the shape of the final texture. And as things dry, that paper pulp's going to add some really beautiful ground texture that may or may not show up in the final product depending upon how much static grass you choose to add, but we'll talk about that more when we get to it. Now, I had some plaster rocks left over from another project I was working on. This is a great way to use broken pieces of plaster rocks to kind of add a bit more texture to everything. But just keep in mind that if you're going to do that, you really gotta soak the paintbrush and kind of dab away at the surface of the plaster rock in order to stop the plaster you're adding from gumming up the texture of the rock. But you can't use too much because you can start to break down that plaster rock and it will start to look like sandstone. So depending upon what you're going for, maybe you should soak the whole thing, but you do have to be careful about that. Now lastly, we want to knock down some of the ridges and the texture that might have been left over from the brush. So I'm just picking this paper plate a few inches up off the ground and dropping it onto the desktop over and over again. And that's kind of causing everything to settle and self-level. I've seen some videos where people kind of bang on the table a little bit, but my table is very sturdy, so that doesn't really work for me. And I find that you get more consistent results with the dropping method. Then you can kind of go back in, and anywhere where you can see that you're really lacking anything or there's some really weird textures that just aren't going away, you can add a small dollop of plaster to it again and then do the dropping technique over again. One of the next steps is to go ahead and knock out your basic colors. Now we're going to be doing something a little bit fun with the stonework, so we're going to go a little bit more in depth with that in just a minute, but just keep in mind, if it's stone, it needs to be gray. If it's dirt, it needs to be brown. And if it's a tree, it needs to be brown. And then you're going to want to take a slightly brighter brown. I tend to use XV88 just because it's a really vibrant brown, and do a light dry brush over all of the dirt areas. Don't worry about if you get a little bit of it on the stone. It's not going to be the end of the world. And then let's carry on to the next step and let's put some serious detail on these rocks. Up next is a technique called leopard spotting, and this is going to be a bit of a messy technique, so we want to go ahead and lay down any kind of sand and aggregate around the rocks, whether they're molded rocks or whether they're ones that we carved from styrofoam. This is going to be anywhere where we're not going to be putting grass, so in this case less is more, but we want to put this down now because the leopard spotting technique is kind of messy, and we do want it to kind of run into this sand and aggregate, and that's going to kind of help to blend everything together. So leopard spotting is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. We're just dabbing on different earth tones onto this rock. You'll notice I'm using a mixture of browns and blacks. I've got a sand color and I've got a greenish kind of almost, we'll call it a mossy color. And I'm just kind of lightly putting that all over the rocks. Now I'm going a little heavier on the blacks and a little heavier on the greens, because this is meant to be kind of rock that has been out in nature for a while. It's not like it's on a cliffside where rocks are constantly eroding away. Maybe this is in the corner of a farmer's field or something like that. So I'm sticking more to those earthy tones than I am that fresh boulder kind of color. And we're just dotting it on. Now you can see every now and again I am spraying the rock. This is a mixture of 50% water and 50% rubbing alcohol. This is just helping to break down the tension, and if you don't have a spritz bottle like I do, you can take a fresh brush and just kind of lightly paint the surface of everything that you want to leopard spot with this mixture, and then come back in with your brush that you're using to apply your color. And we're just haphazardly kind of just dotting it all over. I'm not really following any kind of pattern. The more random it is, the more it's going to feel like it's in nature. I've seen a lot of people go very lightly on the first pass, let it dry, and then do a second pass. For me, I've kind of just zone out and kind of do it all in one go. One of the things that I do last, though, is I go ahead and load up with either a brown or a green, and I slowly spin my project, and anywhere where I see that I've missed entirely, or maybe there's a spot where there's some of the original white from the plaster still sticking out, I just go ahead and dab the brush right in there and just dye that to get it more of an earth tone. And then we just want to let things dry so that we can do some dry brushing afterwards. Now, because this isn't a display piece, we don't need to get super fancy with our dry brushing. We can even do a little bit of over brushing, and that's just where you don't quite wick as much off of the brush before you start dabbing it all over. And you'll see I'm just kind of picking out the raised edges with the original gray that we painted everything with. And then I'm doing one additional highlight where I'm mixing a bone color with this gray, and I'm just kind of hitting those sharp edges. I'm not looking for anywhere where it's soft and rounded over like erosion. I'm just looking for nice sharp edges, and I'm just picking those out to make them a little bit brighter and to help them stand out. One final touch before we go ahead and add the static grass, I'm just going ahead and rimming the base with a brown color and just making sure that there aren't any areas that didn't get painted along the edge. Now you could also rim this with a black, but the grass is going to kind of overhang a little bit, so I just want to go ahead and paint that brown, and it'll help it to blend in with whatever tabletop it ends up on in the future. Now I like to cut my PVA glue with just a little bit of water. It helps to spread it around a little bit more and gets a more even finish. Now it's not the end of the world if you don't cover up 100% of the brown base texture. That will help to give it a little bit more variation. But we're just going to go ahead and cover the entire thing except for the rocks and the sand and the aggregate in glue. And then I'm going to be using a bit of a forest blend that I have mixed up of different static grasses. And then I'll sprinkle a little bit of a highlight, which is a brighter, like significantly brighter green than what I've put down. And I just very lightly with that one. If you've only got one kind of grass texture to play with, don't worry about it. You just put down what you've got and it'll be more than good enough. I know it's a little hard to see. We'll do a close-up here in a second, but this is essentially done at this point. You may want to come back in with a little bit of something around the base of where your trees are going to be at if you've included trees in yours. And that's just to simulate some leaf fall. My recommendation, if you do want to simulate some leaf fall or some clutter or stuff underneath the trees, is to use tea. tea leaves are really great for this sort of thing, and what you're going to want is you're going to want tea from a bag. It's going to be all different levels of ground up. It's not going to look like tea anymore. And you're going to water down some glue, and you're going to spritz the area, or even just using a pipette, you're going to get the whole area around the tree wet, and then you're going to apply that clutter very loosely, and that is going to give you a very realistic effect. Real quick before I show you the grand reveal, I just want to state that the trees that we're using in today's video are provided by the client. They didn't want anything super large. Typically I like to do the make-it-yourself pine tree style trees. I think they look a little nicer for wargaming, but that's just my personal opinion. If you'd like me to do a video about how to actually build one of these kinds of trees, because they can be a little tricky for people who have never done them before, just let me know in the comments and I'll try to come up with an excuse to use some of these. And here we have it, the final results. Honestly, I really like these. I did these as a commission, but I've done similar stuff like this back when the game store was open, although I used MDF. And there's some really cheap alternatives to MDF, so maybe we'll talk about that in a future video. I've got an idea for a way of doing modular terrain, in the sense of having a bunch of pieces of scatter terrain that could all be placed together in order to create one large piece of terrain, or one large point of interest, depending upon the type of game that you're playing, whether it's a tabletop RPG like Dungeons and Dragons, or whether it's a war game like Warhammer. But in any case, I had a lot of fun with this, and I think I'm going to make some of these for myself. I crunched the math based on how long it took me to make this video, and assuming that I wasn't making another video, I think I could probably make about 15 of these in a weekend, which seems like a lot, and it kind of is. Honestly, I think you'd only need about 8 of these to really fill a table. But they were fun, they were easy, and they look great. In any case, I've been Graham Johnson, this is Tabletop Glory, thank you so much for watching, and as always, may your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.